Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Ruff. I'm the Executive Director of the Great Schools Partnership, and I'm really excited to invite everybody to the panel here today. And I want to extend my appreciations to Nicki, Slaugh, Alison, Kearney, and Chelsea Waite, who are joining us as panelists today here to really share what I think will be some exciting ideas of what's going on, what they're seeing out there in some of these troubled times. I also want to recognize specifically Sarah Bishop-Root from ExcelinEd, who has really worked tirelessly to bring all of this together and to get us all on the same page and to really shape this panel for folks. So I wanted to note that quite a few schools and districts have spent the last several years really trying to figure out how to move forward with personalized learning. And I know that it's used a lot of different names across the country, different language that's used there, but really it's about trying to place the student at the center of her or his learning and really revolve learning around them so they get agency and autonomy about that. So into this mix comes the pandemic. It certainly threw everything up into the air last spring. We lay on top of that the social and racial unrest that has gone across the country. And in the middle of this, we say to teachers, we say to students, we say to parents and caregivers, we want you to keep going with learning. We want you to keep this school going forward. We want you to still enable our kids to better themselves on that. This is a Herculean request of people to do that. I mean, there are very few professions, I think, that we could say, we're going to send you home today. We want you to come back tomorrow, and it's going to be an entirely different circumstance for you. And we want teachers to redesign your curriculum. We want you to redesign how you spend time. We want you to redesign how you grade. We want you to redesign how you instruct. All of that's going to happen. And oh, by the way, we'll give you 24 hours to do that and be ready for it. It's an unbelievable task that's there. And so I'm really excited to say that I think more so than we could have hoped for. Again, teachers, students, and families have really responded to that challenge. Now, in the midst of this, I want to note that as we look across the field and we see schools, we're seeing schools that are navigating this better than others. And I want to note that I think everybody's working really hard, and at the same time, some places are doing a better job than others. And so we start to look at that and figure out what is going on in these places that are actually trying to figure this out. I want to note, and I want to give Sarah credit for this, that she really has been thinking a lot about what does it mean for the design of schools in the midst of a crisis like this, and how do we actually design schools to think about ways that we can anticipate that things like this will happen. I mean, I very much hope we don't see another pandemic roll up. I very much hope we can start to address and settle some of the racial and social unrest that's happening across the country. But to design things and not anticipate that we're going to have some struggles here is probably a Pollyanna-ish strategy. And so today, when we listen in and hear from these folks, what we really want to know is, why? What are you doing? What's going on here? We've got two folks from schools that can share that. And we've got Chelsea who can really share what she's seeing across the country in multiple places about that. And then to think a little bit about what does that mean for us in terms of designing our schools and designing learning for kids, and what should we be thinking about? So the process we're going to go through, I want to be clear on this. We have three panelists with us today, but I don't really want you guys to be thinking of it as a panel, but much more as a fishbowl. And so we're going to start. Allie's going to go, and then Nicki, and then Chelsea, giving a little bit of background about their work and where they're at. Brief overviews on that. And I've warned them all that I would turn off their microphones if they went on too long. I'm pretty sure they won't. And then we'll go through a couple of questions that I'll be putting out there to them. And as this goes on, we really want this to be a conversation you guys get to listen in on. And so it's not going to be a normal panel where it's a question from me and then the panelists and then a different panelist than me and then a panelist and then me and a panelist, but rather a conversation that you get to hear us talk back and forth about what's happening. And there may be some times, as a warning, that we're not in total agreement, but we're doing that so you all as the participants can understand and see what's happening out there with what's going on. As an aside, I will be monitoring the room chat If you're not familiar with this software that we're using here, up at the top of your screen, you can see a chat. And if you click that, you have 3 options that are down there. And please click on the room chat. And if you put messages in there, I'll be able to see those. And so if you have questions, put those right in there, and we'll actually start to engage in those that are here. We've got a relatively small group here with us today. And so if you guys have questions, I really hope you put them in there. We can really dig into those. So let's get started with this. Allie, you're up first. Give us a little bit of background about you and the fabulous work that's underway at Noble.
Sure. Thanks, David. So my name's Alison Kearney. I am an assistant principal and director of studies at Noble High School in North Berwick, Maine. And our school is an 8 through 12 school with about 1,200 students. And by Maine standards, that's considered a relatively large high school. We are rural in nature. Our school services 3 towns that spans about 130 miles in terms of sort of the geographic sort of distance between kids in the district. We are, considered a school that has relatively high free and reduced lunch numbers, about 44%. We also are servicing a town and towns where we lack basic services. There's no public transportation, and by default, the school kind of takes on the role as a community school, offering many of the basic community services here. And I think that, as we sort of talk about the things that allowed us to sort of be a little more prepared during the midst of this pandemic, I think already being in that place of being a service provider in a lot of areas was one of those things that helped us. As far as a school, we've had a firm stance and mission around equity, and really took a good look at both the external and internal driving forces for providing educational services for kids. So we always had a commitment to personalized, rigorous educational systems, and given that we were able to draw from all of those components into this system as well, and focus on some that were more helpful than others. As far as a school, when we talk about personalized learning, as David had mentioned, it's not just sort of this one component. We see it as sort of a collection of things. And at our school, we consider school design a primary component of our personalized learning model. We are unique in that we have vertical learning academies here. Kids are on the same sort of academy as they move up for 5 years within the same team. So it's a school within a school model. And kids, instead of being in a school of 1,200, really feel they're in a school of about 100 kids or so. We have heterogeneously grouped courses. We do have AP courses, but by and large, kids are heterogeneously grouped in all of the required courses for graduation. We allow for common planning time for teachers who are also, again, teamed with the same group of folks. And that was really valuable to us as we move forward. The other component of that system of personalized learning is our standards and proficiency-based system of teaching and learning. And various elements came into play, again, with that system. Some of them we rolled back, and some of them we really heightened as we moved through this. We also consider a third component of our personalized learning model around academic and social emotional supports. And then finally, the last component is around multiple flexible pathways. So all of that kind of came together in various ways as we moved through this. And I will kind of leave it there.
Great. Hey, hi. Thanks, Allie. Nicki, you're up.
Hey, my name is Nicki Slaugh, and I've been in education for 19 years. I started off as an elementary educator, kindergarten, first, second, third. Then I moved into instructional technology coaching for K through 12 educators, and this is my 5th year as an administrator. I am the principal of the junior high at Quest Academy Technology Charter School. So I run the 6 through 9 campus. We're actually a K through 9 campus. So we have about 1,000 kids K through 9. So our charter is technology. We have an emphasis on STEM. We're a STEM designated school, and we focus on computer science. And then personalized learning has always been my baby since I took over 5 years ago. So it's something that I was really passionate about, and coming from elementary education. And I believe in teaching to the standards, as well as differentiating and helping our students become independent learners. So kind of the model we followed was first helping the teachers understand how to move from a teacher-centered classroom to a student-centered classroom. So it was really important to me to help get that vision across and create a culture where we're a team, a culture where I hire teachers that are questioners. They're always trying to question things, problem solve, because when you take on a big change like this, it's important to have a group of individuals that work together as a team. Work ethic is really important as for our students and our teachers. So that's something that we really take pride in, is teaching the students the importance of work ethic and the time that you need to put in to learn things. We model that as teachers, as teams. We support each other in going into the classrooms and stuff. We're always trying to model to our students what we want them to do with each other. We focus a lot on the 4 C's, and obviously collaboration, communication, creativity. All that is really important to us. So basically, the biggest thing I can say is helping your teachers understand that it's okay to give up the will and let the students be the drivers in their educational pathway. And it takes a little bit of trust in that relationship of forming, communicating with those kids, connecting with those kids, figuring out what they value. They need to have a safe environment to learn and grow and fail and make mistakes, but just giving those kids the opportunity to be independent learners, then I thought they'll thrive in a personalized learning classroom, as well as that's something that helped us be successful with COVID, is just that independence and building confidence within our teachers and as well as our students, because it's very hard to let go.
Great. And actually, before I jump to Chelsea, let me just double check for both Nicki and Allie. Are all your students one-to-one with laptops or devices of some sort? And that was before any of this hit?
Yes.
And so that was a part of your ongoing work. The kids were used to having a laptop, used to being online, used to being engaged with technology. So it was not one of those things that you had to quickly get those into the hands of students.
Right.
Great. Thank you. So Chelsea.
Great. Thanks, David. Such a pleasure to be here with Alison and Nicki. I am a researcher at the Christensen Institute. And so our education team at the Institute is dedicated to the idea that students deserve better than trial and error innovation. And that in fact, we actually know a lot about how innovation works through a set of innovation theories that we use as kind of lenses to analyze all of the research that we do. So that's the work of the Institute's education team broadly. And today, sort of showing up here in this room, I'm going to bring to bear 2 of the research projects that I've led at the Institute. One of them is a national kind of crowdsourcing process to surface school innovation across the country and kind of expand the aperture that we have on what constitutes school innovation, what are the different models that are out there, and how do we start to recognize that innovation is not kind of a limited playground for a small number of schools, but in fact, many conditions for student-centered learning already exist in lots of schools around the country in all different kinds of circumstances. And we can look to models of schools that are really making steps in that direction in order to inform the ways that we support a much greater number of schools to move towards student-centered models. So that's the Canopy project, and I'll be able to share a little bit about what we're seeing in our newest round of data collection from all of the schools, the 144 schools that participated in the Canopy process this past fall, and hopefully will again now that we're doing another round of crowdsourcing over the winter. The second thing I'll just call out is a research project that I dove into with a colleague over the summer. Sort of right when COVID hit, we were hearing kind of conflicting narratives. On the one hand, some folks saying, this is the moment. It's now unavoidable. We will, the education system will transform through this moment of upheaval. And on the other hand, a lot of folks saying, are you kidding me? All we want to do is get back to normal. We just have to make it through this time until we can reopen schools, and then we can sort of be back in this normal state. And so my colleague and I dug into some research, really with the motivation that we didn't think either of those narratives was inherently true. And we wanted to understand, what is it about the ways that schools are constructed and their organizational models, kind of the DNA that makes them tick, that would make it more or less likely that promising changes that are introduced this year, when sort of the ground has shifted underneath schools, make it more likely that those promising changes can actually persist into the future and not just snap back to normal, because we know that normal wasn't working for a whole lot of kids across the country, not to mention educators. So that's the second lens I'll bring to our conversation today, sort of this question of, if we are indeed seeing some promising changes that are in part being forced by the pandemic, then what's the likelihood that we might see some of those things persist, and how can we make it more likely?
Great. Thank you, Chelsea. Just as an aside too, if people want to see the list of schools that are in the Canopy project, can they go to your website and find that?
Yeah, it's an easy URL. It's canopyschools.org.
Great.
Which leads to a data portal where you can explore all the schools.
Great. I would, having been on that, I would suggest people, if you're looking for some ideas, it's a great resource to take a look at that. So, let me actually vault off of something that Chelsea just said there, when she said, that many of the conditions for student-centered learning already exist that are out there, which is, I think, great news for all of us to think about some of the pieces that we can move forward with. But I want to go back to Allie and Nicki. And so think back a little bit last spring when you heard there was going to be a shutdown of it was a little unclear what it was going to be, what was going to happen, but you all knew things were not going to be the same. What fear rose to the surface for you guys? And perhaps more importantly, what realities in your school gave you assurance that, you know what, we can make it through this. We're going to be okay. These are the things that we can build upon. So I don't know, Allie or Nicki, who wants to jump in on that?
Sure. I'd be happy to start. There was obviously a lot of things that came to mind as concerns, but initially, given the proximity of where we were in the school year, March, we first started thinking, maybe not first, but our senior class and meeting graduation requirements and how all of that was going to work. Our school-based requirements for diploma are well beyond what our state requirements are. And so under normal conditions, we are always kind of white knuckling things as we make sure all of our kids are eligible to receive a diploma. I guess, sort of to your point, David, of what were we glad to have in place to sort of rectify that concern, was this idea of our standards and proficiency-based system of teaching and learning. Teachers were already equipped at looking at bodies of evidence and not necessarily being so pedantic about this assignment, that assignment. We already disaggregate work habits. We already had a system in place for revisions and retakes and extensions of deadlines and numerous access points and flexible pathways. And again, because we were so far beyond our state-based requirements, it gave us some flexibility on how we looked at diploma eligibility. So that was sort of one piece. The second is that we have a population of students here that has endured some significant trauma. And we are a trauma-informed school, so we were able to implement a lot of those practices and philosophies across this work and really put our focus during that initial phase on things like food security, wellness, being physical and emotional connectedness along with that continuity of learning. So sort of those other sort of more whole student view came into place, I think, a lot of because of our stance on and trauma-informed practices. We obviously were really concerned about access to resources also. Luckily, we were a one-to-one school initially. We had just completed a technology audit, both for kids who maybe had broken a device, lost a device, had been limping along using their phone and we just didn't know it, or didn't have internet at home and we didn't know it. So because we had done that before the shutdown, we were able to disseminate new devices and hotspots to those kids who did not have one of those two things. So we felt pretty good from day one about access to that. And then obviously food and mental health resources and other supports we already had in place. We just transferred those things online and then developed a food delivery model. And then I would say lastly, the biggest concern, which still is the concern now, is student motivation and engagement, making sure that we're not losing students, losing touch with students in the remote setting especially. And that is where we've really been reliant upon our teaming structure, our response to intervention program, or multi-tiered systems of support. We have a model called BAR, which is building assets, reducing risks. So that sort of familial aspect that we had always had as a school, again, that first component of our personalized learning model really around school design and then supports has helped us mitigate some of those concerns.
So Allie, let me dig in just a little bit here before we jump to Nicki here. A lot of places did some of these things beyond learning. You know, they found ways to get food to kids. They found ways to get services to kids. Did that, but we saw a lot of places that actually kind of got mired in that. I mean, that's what they got into. It took all their time. They got focused on that, and that's kind of what they got done. And then moving on to the teaching and learning that was also changing. A lot of them didn't get to that. They weren't able to. They didn't have the capacity to get there. Mm-hmm. What do you think was different about your situation where you were able to do some of those things that were totally necessary, had to be done, and get on to those other things that you wanted to do?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that when we look at it, we kind of compartmentalize the responsibilities. The teachers were not shouldering, the burden of making sure that those technology components were in place, or that the food was being delivered, or the services provided. Their ultimate responsibility was taking a look at how to deliver or redesign the curriculum instruction, and then to, move student learning the best that they could. So I think that while teachers were aware that as a district we were, doing some heavy lifting on those other items, we tried to sort of buffer and shield them from being the deliverers of those services, and really keeping them kind of focused on that, on those other components. And our district is large enough that we were able to do that. So.
Great. Thanks, Allie. So Nicki, what about you? The shutdown comes, you look and think, oh my God, this is not great. And here's what we're going to do. And what gave you confidence that you guys could actually forge ahead?
Okay, so the very first thing that popped into my mind was obviously the mental health of our students. So our motto is every student, every day, whatever it takes. And the first thing I thought of was, school is their safe environment. School is their home away from home. They have such a relationship with their teachers and their peers. And I was thinking, I just believe in the power of the human connection. So how can I keep their peers communicating with each other? How can I see that we're going to be okay? How can I help them see that we're going to be okay under turmoil and stress and all of this? So the very first thing is, I thought I still want them to have normalcy and routine. So we took the route of having a digital bell schedule. So we quickly created a digital bell schedule for the students. And where we are a technology-based school, I was very confident in the transition from moving from on-campus to e-learning, because we are a Google certified school. All of my teachers and students are Google certified when they come to Quest. They're very familiar with all of the apps on Google. Everything we do runs through Google Classroom, and we have our own Google Gradebook, Google Planner, Tracker. Everything is consistent. So basically the transition of how do you submit work, how do you see what is expected in the classroom, we had already set up before. So the confidence part came into, we set a goal 5 years ago that we want to have create a program at Quest Junior High that 24/7 the students have access to everything that they need. So no matter what device they're on, or no matter where they're at, they can see the curriculum and have multiple resources to learn. So I kind of hopped around, but let's go back. I really needed the kids to feel normal, have a routine. They would log in every period face-to-face with their teacher and their peers. It was really important to me. A requirement would be they need to see that smile on that kid's face and make sure they're okay. They needed to be there to answer any questions or concerns or stresses that the kids had. Then we made sure that we gave every student time to communicate with peers to see that they're all great. Their friends are still there. They can still communicate through the power of technology. Once we made that decision, that we were going to have the kids actually log on all day through all their periods, as well as sign up for one-on-one tutoring through Google Classroom with our teachers after, we felt like then we would, that was my number one concern, because I felt very confident in that transition of students were already submitting their work through Google Classroom with technology. Teachers were already meeting the individual needs of students by data. So we were already had the personalized learning to where everyone works at their own pace. Everyone has a different learning pathway, because our focus in previous years were to identify yourself as a learner. So we don't call students at Quest students, we call students at Quest learners, and teachers aren't teachers, they're facilitators. Because when you move from teacher-led classroom to student-led classroom, that's when you start to give those kids the opportunities to identify how they learn. So there wasn't like a set program for our students. Everything was in one platform on Google. And then where we have already provided them the tools and the resources to be an independent learner and to identify which way they learn best. And with the personalized learning aspect, they were already deciding when they felt they were a 1, 2, 3, 4 in their mastery level, because we have a very rigorous high mastery expectancy, that's when they choose to take the test. So we don't even have kids take assessments at the same time. We're truly personalized. Some kids do better on essay type questions, others too orally. Sometimes we do projects. So through our individual pathway of learning and the fact that we let the kids learn at their own pace, they're used to collaborating in groups. It was a really easy transition for us because we would just get them on Google Meet, identify, make sure they're okay, and then we would group them according through data with the standards for mastery-based learning, put them with their kids. They could collaboratively work through Google Meet, and the teacher would hop from group to group and check on them and provide the mentoring and the coaching they need to be successful. And then one last thing that's really important, I already told you about the tutoring at the end of the day to make sure that they had time to be one-on-one with their teacher, but we have a really important part of the day that's called advisory, where they meet with their advisor, where they set personal goals and academic goals every week, which ties to their standards as well as the learning process and what they need to do. So just by having all of that in place before helped for a really smooth transition. So my main priority was just making sure the kids were okay every day and that they still felt love, even though we weren't face to face. Internet issues, possibly. Luckily, Comcast, we were already one-to-one, but luckily with Comcast, they were able to provide free internet to our families that needed it. So that helped there. We did have some Wi-Fi issues and so forth.
Right. So some, as you might expect anywhere, some technology issues, but you're able to work through those. Before I jump to Chelsea here, I think a key thing you talked about there was that the students knew what was expected of them. They knew what they were expected to learn. They knew the system they were going to learn it in. They were very aware of all that. So it wasn't like they were dependent upon teachers to give them that information. It was already a part of what they knew. Am I hearing that right?
Yes. I feel like I know the questions come up lately with the pandemic and everything is, what is the barrier in education? I actually think teachers could be the barrier because sometimes the teacher, I've been in that same position as a teacher. We stand up, we're the one delivering the information. We're the one deciding what to test them on, what they have to memorize, what notes they take. We have all that control. So I think the barrier in a process like this would be the teacher, because if they've created a classroom environment where they're the one resource that the student gets all their information from and their study skills from, that would be the problem here. By me removing that barrier of the teacher being the one and only place where they get their information, or we've taught them how to collaborate with each other, to use different resources that our teachers have previously put in the classroom. That helped it run very smooth. I just basically years ago when we had 24/7 access, back then, not knowing of the pandemic, it was more of if a student's absent, can they get everything they need from your Google Classroom, even though you're not there? Obviously, blended learning is the best. There's the power with that teacher and that connection. But have you provided enough resources and a variety of resources for different learning styles in your Google Classroom platform for a student to learn anywhere, on any device, any type of the day? And the best part about it is even before this, kids would, if they're in the airport going on vacation, they could log on their Google Meet to see where their kids are in the classroom, right? And kind of communicate with them. So I just think the power of technology, the power of connecting with the student to where they want to be present in their classroom. They want to still ask you questions because they value you as a teacher and a friend, as well as the closeness within their peers and collaborating with each other helped.
Thanks, Nicki. I don't know if I can speak for everybody, but I can say when I was in 8th grade going on vacation, about the last thing I was worrying about was logging on to find out what else was going on at school at that point. So real accolades to you that you're getting kids going on vacation looking to figure out what's going on in school. So let me jump over to Chelsea here. So we're 9 months into the pandemic and to the some of the social and racial unrest that has sprouted across the country. You know, what patterns are you seeing in how schools are working to successfully address these various hybrid, virtual, and in-person instructional strategies? What are you seeing? Kind of like, we got two concrete examples here. What are you seeing across this work?
Well, and it's great because these two concrete examples that we're hearing from, I think, illustrate a range of the kinds of patterns that looking through the set of Canopy schools, as well as talking to a range of them in the recent weeks, I think are illustrated kind of across that data set as well. I'm gonna kind of bring up 4 core points. I could probably talk about this forever, but I'm gonna keep it to 4. One of them, I think that you heard very clearly through both Alison and Nicki's reflections, which is that if we ever considered social emotional learning and sort of relationship-centered educational experiences as different from personalized learning or student-centered learning, now is the time to sort of stop considering those things as separate things. It really stuck in my head once that I was speaking with someone and asked them about schools they know that are doing student-centered learning or personalized learning. And they asked, do you mean personalization through relationships or personalization through technology? As if those are 2 kind of like separate pathways. And I think you're hearing in both of these cases that those are like intimately woven together to create a more student-centered experience. So if you look across the entire Canopy data set, 90% of all of the schools that participated in the Canopy project this fall reported that social emotional learning is part of how they do school. Just under half of those cite SEL as one of only 5 kind of core practices. And there are also a range of other practices that are closely related to SEL that other schools cite as core. So I think you see a whole lot of schools being nominated as student-centered learning schools that see social emotional learning as absolutely critical to how they do what they do. I spoke to one of our school leaders in the Canopy the other day, and he said something I think really powerful, that he used to think that mental health was a secondary function at best of a modern school. And now he believes it's absolutely central to what they do. So one kind of big takeaway that I think we're seeing across the country. 2 is a theme around student ownership, agency, and really when I talk about those words, I think we're talking about power, student power. Lots of schools in the Canopy, including these 2 examples that you're hearing here, are indicating that students are developing projects in their project-based learning units. Students are setting their own learning goals and helping to define their learning pathways. Families are participating in decision-making at the school. Students are organized into kind of peer-to-peer support groups. And this is not a story about how schools that are doing a good job responding to COVID are those that are attended by motivated students. This is a story about schools that set up systems and processes that recognize the assets that students bring to the table and are actually finding ways to rely on those young people to take on part of the work of what it means to learn in school. I think similarly, seeing a number of the schools that I'm talking to recently talk about real distributed leadership models. So not just thinking about the roles of students participating in decision-making and taking an active role in their own learning, but also thinking about other figures in the school as holding real decision-making power. I think a lot of what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic especially was like a classic reaction to crisis, where in a moment of crisis, we kind of lock down. And it's like command and control is the reaction to a moment where nobody knows what's happening. And while I think there are, totally legitimate reasons for that being the case, I think a lot of those schools that are reporting having more success in kind of growing from that moment and finding ways to thrive in a really difficult year are the ones that went in a totally opposite direction and actually handed off major decision-making power, even about things like curriculum, school day schedule, all of these kind of foundational elements of schools being transferred into, core team leads or teachers who are able to make significant decisions in those areas. The 2 last things I'll quickly say, one of them is around competency-based education, of course, being, having a long history now among many schools and state policies that are reflecting that as a possibility. But seeing many more schools now taking much more dramatic steps, much more quickly towards things like standards-based grading that kind of are steps towards competency-based systems. If we ever thought that a 70% or 80% was a meaningful reflection about what you know and what you need to continue to work on, now that means even less now. And so I've talked to a few schools that have said, yeah, we've thought about competency-based systems or standards-based grading as a possibility for some time in the future, but in the middle of the summer this year, we just decided to go for it, and we locked ourselves in a room and figured out the rubrics, and now we're implementing. We never thought we'd move that fast, but that's what we had to do to help families and caregivers as well as students, understand how to best support their learning. The last quick thing I'll say, David, is around, I actually think that we have a number, given how broad the kind of spectrum is in terms of innovative models across the country, some of the designs that schools are really committed to have, I think, made it harder to transition in the pandemic. And one of those is around schools that are deeply committed. Their whole models are organized around community-based projects, where students are actually partnering with organizations and businesses in the community and diving into real-world projects. I think figuring out how to make that work in a virtual or remote environment has really been a challenge and hasn't necessarily lended itself to an easy, smooth transition. But that I was just talking with the school leader from Iowa Big, where that is sort of at the center of their model. And he was saying that one of the biggest changes they've made this year was a practical one, to move to only one project at a time for students rather than 2 or even 3. But now that they've done that for the whole fall semester, he thinks they might never go back to multiple projects at once, because projects are moving so much faster, the learning is so much deeper. And so it's really been a blessing in disguise to kind of simplify and focus, go slow to go fast. And it's one of those unexpected benefits.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. And a warning to the 3 of you, here's kind of where we go off script from what you've said, some really interesting ideas to start digging into. And let me again encourage people, if you have questions, you've heard things that you're starting to think about, I know that I am, just these words of wisdom we're hearing here, please go to the chat and then on the in the room chat and actually start putting some ideas in there. We'll be monitoring those and trying to follow along with questions people might have on that. But I want to actually circle back to something Chelsea just said and really take this back to Ali and Nicki to dig in a little bit more about this. I'm fascinated by that idea of distributed leadership, because I think a lot of times one of the reactions is it's a crisis. We've got to put all the leadership into a single person who has to make all the decisions, and that person will, lead us forward. There'll be this, superhero to do that. And what I'm hearing, Chelsea, you said that's not what you're seeing, and I don't think that's actually the case at your 2 schools. That you've got to figure out who's taking on what, and we all have to have more leadership here in this. So unpack that a little bit for me. What does, how has leadership changed in your schools?
Sure. I mean, I can start, David. If we kind of again, there's a pre-existing structure that became heightened under these conditions, and I think we're seeing a lot of that as sort of a natural selection process, right? Where we put emphasis and focus naturally, there is emphasis and focus naturally put on things that are beneficial during these conditions, and then things sort of, I think there's attrition to other things that aren't. But so we had a school-based leadership team here. Again, like we had said, we have a team, but we are a big school who sees this as sort of a large system of things that are all interconnected. And so in order to get things accomplished or to keep a pulse on the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of certain initiatives and programs, we have to have teacher leaders sort of be at the forefront of a lot of these initiatives. Otherwise, it's impossible to have, again, one person do that. And so I think that for us, what we saw is that we were able to sort of increase our capacity either for communication, dissemination of information, or to actuate change through really relying on those teacher leaders who were through the liaison, if you will, or boots on the ground on certain things. An example is that we had to completely revise our senior capstone experience twice. To the first iteration under the March version of the shutdown, and then under our current model. And we relied heavily upon the teachers that oversee that project. And that's something that Noble has, we've been, again, known for, that we've done those senior capstones for a long time, but we're really heavily relying on 2 teacher leaders to oversee that entire project. It's not a simple project because it also interfaces with our ability to award our diplomas. They're tied into our 21st century learning expectations, tied into a system of school-wide rubric. So there's complexity there. So small changes have a domino effect, but we have to really trust in those individuals. And I think under these conditions, as a school-based leader, we really learned to really extend that trust, to be comfortable with that trust. And I think that's something that will continue to carry through. Yeah.
So Nicki, what about you, and what happened there with the whole the leadership conversation?
So obviously I have different goals where she's worried about graduation and the seniors. I have more of the middle school children, so I had different goals during that. I think absolutely. I'm definitely one of those leaders that I believe if I'm a good leader, when I'm at the same thing I'm expecting from my teachers with my students. If I'm out of the building for a state meeting, can my school still run appropriately? Do my teachers understand my philosophy and everything? How would they handle a situation without me in the building? So I've set up a way where I want to empower my teachers and let them know that I do trust them and they're leaders. So ahead of time, again, that's that culture again. Do my teachers feel their voice matters? During my hiring process, I'm always looking for, like I mentioned before, work ethic. I'm making sure I bring a bunch of diverse teachers in to see everybody has different strengths, what they bring, they're unique. And then questioners. This is something that's really important to me as a leader, is to hire teachers that are questioners more than those teachers that, I'm not going to call them robots, but they would rather be like, here's your curriculum, direct instruction, the ones that just say yes, ma'am all the time. I want the risk takers, the teachers that are going to question things that come up, or why do we do this? Always asking the why. Is this what's best for kids? So I think creating an environment of teachers where they feel like they're empowered and valued and can ask questions helps. Throughout the pandemic, little things that I'm going to go back to is just the sense of routine and normalcy. So in the spring, some things that were important to us, obviously, we always strive in end of level testing. So we do countdowns and do a big, huge sort of, depending what the theme is, 1 year was countdown to the Super Bowl, Sage Super Bowl. End of level testing is really important to us because we focus on student growth, and our students actually get excited to take the end of level test. We have a very big awards assembly that's at the end of the year. Field day is important to us. Just little things like that we have always done. We made sure that we met weekly to decide how can we still provide these same activities for the kids at home versus at school. And so basically, in order to get kids engaged, I think it's just letting them know that you're going to do everything in your power to make it work. So even though there was a pandemic and turmoil, we still made sure we still had virtual field day. We still did our awards assembly because those 9th graders need to be honored with those specific awards that in the past kids have done. So everything we've done in the past, our whole goal, every Friday, we still had our faculty meetings, was basically what can we do this week for the kids that they would be getting if we were in school. And that kind of kept the engagement and the attendance high because I think we're always questioning things and we just are big group problem solvers.
Can I jump in here, David, and say something about, I mean, now I think the word culture has come up a couple times, but one of the really, I think, useful insights from some of the research that my colleague and I did over the summer is the way that we sometimes, I think, consider culture as this kind of magic phenomenon in schools. But there's a really interesting lens on culture that says culture is actually, it forms from the ways that we solve problems consistently over time. So when I was talking about like school organizational models as one of the things that we really have to understand before we can kind of make reasonable predictions about whether changes that are introduced during this time are going to stick around. Those organizational models are made up of the resources that you use to do what you do, the processes that you then put in place to kind of harness those resources to deliver on what you're expected to accomplish, your priorities. And so the kind of rule of thumb that we that we talk about all the time is the way that resources, processes, and priorities times time equals culture. And so I think one of the things that I'm hearing in listening to Nicki and Alison talk about their individual school context is just the ways that there were elements of culture around who makes decisions, who steps up, who owns what, that seemed to be in place sort of long before all of this happened. And in a way, you could have thrown sort of any number of challenges at either of these schools. And my guess is that the culture is part of the key of what allowed the schools to pivot and to make to problem solve in effective ways. Even though obviously there are circumstantial benefits like having a one-to-one program in place already, I think a lot of what I'm hearing is the ways that that strong school culture that empowered many different stakeholders in the school to help solve problems seem to be really key. Would you both
trust each other and value each other? And I think when you create a team of teachers, that's who's making the magic happen, the teachers, right? And so it's important for me to have my teachers support each other and value each other and trust each other. If you have a team of teachers that aren't close like that, like a family, I think then you would struggle. Obviously with questioners, I'm going to have a lot of disagreements at first, but at the same time, we always circle back and end up giving the person credit that ended up coming up with the correct answer for that moment. And again, I have the model of let's try it. If we fail, it's okay. We take what we did and we try it again. So I let my teachers know I'd rather them take that risk for those students, try it. If it doesn't work, we'll reevaluate and do it again, just as I want the students to do in the classroom. So.
Yeah, just Chelsea, around like the culture of innovation, I think that one of the things that has been sort of a tenet of what we've always done is we've considered ourselves relatively, progressive school in a more conservative area. And so there's always been that little bit of tension, but teachers have always expected that, Noble is going to try to take, this next progressive step, or going to try this new thing, or not afraid to sort of take something down and rebuild something that would work better. And the idea of being in this sort of external sense of turmoil isn't necessarily new for us. This is a whole other level, obviously, not to minimize, the impact of what's going on. But I feel like sort of our design process around our organizational components or how we envision our graduates are really embedded in this idea that, we aren't satisfied with how things are, and we need to make it better, and that's a system to do that. And so it was just sort of another way to apply that approach under these conditions.
I think what Ali said, one second really fast, what Ali said, if you're going to switch from a traditional setting to personalized learning or traditional to mastery grading, you're going to have to problem solve week after week, month after month anyways, by making that shift. And so it's something that we've probably all been used to. That's why we've been successful, because there's a lot of problems that are going to come from moving from a lecture-based classroom to a personalized learning classroom and so forth. So I think as a team, since we've been going through how to change from traditional to personalized, more competency-based, we went through problems, maybe not like a pandemic, but we went through lots of problems and issues to help improve the school, and we are never satisfied. And I think the fact when you work for a school that's willing to take that risk and do something ahead of times before the community is doing it, that helps.
I think that's a fabulous point to just think about, that if you have a culture that is always problem solving because you're always trying to improve and get better, that when you can get confronted with what was a very serious dilemma and problem, you've already got that culture that does that. I'd be curious, because I'm also, Chelsea, it really struck me when you talked and said that, culture is about how you solve the problems that you've got that are there. I'd be curious if, because of the pandemic, if anything rose to the surface about your culture that you thought, oh, we have to revisit this. This is a piece we've got to rethink about. That as we're looking to the future, that's something that we hadn't thought about before. And maybe there isn't anything, but I'd be curious if it's like a lesson learned of, we're on that. We're working on that right now because this came up to the forefront for us.
Well, so when the school closure where we were all doing e-learning, I felt everything we had in place was very successful because our teachers were home and our students were home. Right now, I have a different situation because our students can choose to come on campus or learn from home. So yes, I have everything set up as I told you. They can log the Google Meet. I'm providing them with the same experience all day, each period. But now the teacher has got to, it's like they're torn 50-50. They have on-campus kids and students at home at the same time during the same period. I've tried to juggle changing periods and trying to put the e-learners in specific periods so that they can have the same experience we did in the spring, but that doesn't work because when students get exposed in quarantine, depending what rotation they're in, the class becomes more of a hybrid approach. So I think the toughest thing right now is when you have teachers that love their students so much and really care about their learning as much as all the teachers do right now, it's killing them right now that they can't give 100% to both the kids at home and at school. So yes, with our collaboration groups, and we've trained our students, we can get a group started in class and we can go check out our e-learners at home and log on the Google Meet with them. We've tried to put some e-learners with on-campus kids so that when we're going from group to group doing our differentiation and meeting the needs of the individual pathways, we've got e-learners with on-campus kids. But I feel like the biggest barrier right now is how do we feel like we're giving our all to on-campus kids and e-learners at the same time? Because what this possibly might not go away. Our families have actually really liked that they can log in from home if they feel sick, or for many reasons, that they can still get attendance and attend class at home while school is still open. So I wonder to myself, is this going to be the new way, or will we go back to just on campus? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I mean, so on that topic, so that's one of I think the challenges that anyone is everyone's going through if they're trying to do this dual world piece. And in the very beginning, we were committed to not doing that. We said, that's pedagogically not sound. We are not going to have teachers doing these dual world situations. And ultimately, we ended up right in the same situations. We were just having a conversation today about what is the future of that. We just spent a significant amount of money retrofitting all of these classrooms to have cameras that follow the teacher, microphones, the whole 9 yards. And so, is this something that is going to continue when, like, we were, very firmly were thinking, this is not a great idea. No one thinks this is a great idea. So I don't know where the future is with that. We had talked about building sort of an external virtual academy, but that's a ton of resources to do that at the high school level. And so that's one of the reasons why we defaulted to this dual world situation. But David, kind of where you were saying, interestingly, one of the things that kind of arose as a weakness, I think, for us that we didn't necessarily realize under these conditions, I think, is around student agency for us. I think that because we are differentiated, so we have heterogeneous grouping, I think we found some weaknesses in some differentiation, and that potentially we over scaffold for kids, and that when put in more independent settings, or where it was really clear that, we weren't going to be able to do that the same way. I think some kids did not necessarily step up to the plate in the same way that we would expect under different circumstances. So I think that we've had to go back and take a look again around universal design elements, differentiation, and then also just empowering kids to make some of their choices around learning in ways that they maybe had some of those choices made for them before.
And I just want to jump in too and sort of recognize that I think a lot of folks at this conference are at the state level and thinking about sort of the translation of policy into schools. And if we think about that kind of equation that I put forward earlier, that a school's resources, processes, and priorities times time equals culture. It basically means that, that schools need to be able to define, this is who we are and this is how we do things. And a lot of those things are defined for them. And I think in these two cases, you've got two schools that have managed to really solidify kind of a unique definition of, like, this is who we are. This is how we do school. And we're going to kind of manage the other competing demands and priorities that are put on us to prioritize the ways that we do school. And so I have been kind of newly excited about and curious about different ways that states and other decision makers at levels higher than schools and districts can think about transferring more decision-making power to schools to define, here's who we are and here's how we do what we do because of our unique context. You've got, two school leaders on this call, plus innumerable others who are making radically different changes about how to do hybrid learning in their own context, based on who they serve, based on community preferences, all of these things. And so, whether it's taking a second look at portfolio districts or empowered school and district models, I think one of the ways that we can together sort of support the growth of strong culture in schools over time is to make sure that schools and districts have really have the ability to consolidate who we are and how we do what we do in ways that those answers are not being imposed on them quite as much.
It's a key piece, I think, as we head towards the end here, that we've talked about power and distributed power and what that means. It's there, and we talk about the policy world, that the notion of a one-size-fits-all and a one solution will fit all in these difficult times is probably pretty easily seen by most people as not a viable option. It's there, but it has some repercussions. It's easy to say one size doesn't fit all, but then we actually have policies that do promote a one-size-fits-all strategy. Yep. We've got to think about how do we maintain, particularly at the state level, some consistency and some commitment to equity across our state and for learning for all kids, and recognize that we have to support and accept different decisions that are made in different schools. And even in large districts, the same thing, that different schools will operate differently. That's there. We've only got a couple of minutes here. Let me just real quickly get a final minute from each of you, and then I'll wrap us up here. Any thoughts that you would say for the folks who have been listening in today that, here's one thing that I hope you walk away with. So I don't know, Nicki, Allie, and Chelsea?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that, if we're going to sort of end on sort of a policy note, I think that it's obviously hard to balance the one size fits all element, where it is something that this is something that we want to afford for all students, right? So we don't want to differentiate in terms of the quality of an experience for any of our students. And when we think of a portrait of a graduate, we want them to all go away with certain things, but we don't all need them to go do the same thing. And I think that there's a really sort of delicate balance between the differentiation of their educational experience in terms of equity, but not, again, to differentiate that quality. And I think that sometimes policies intend to do one thing and it actually does another. And I think that right now, in terms of any policy that can help alleviate some of the discord and division and promote inclusiveness and diversity and equity, if they're in sort of the spirit of that, it will likely translate the correct way.
Great, thank you. Nicki, in a minute or less, what would you send people away with?
I agree with that. And I feel like being in charter, I've been very blessed that I've been able to make decisions because I'm like a charter and a district in one. So every decision I make is for my group of students. And I believe that I have been very successful with that. And so everything that Chelsea and Alison just said, I think that they need to look at is giving each individual school a little bit more power to do what's best for their kids. I truly believe if you teach to the average, you produce average. I'm not a big fan of cookie cutter programs for all 28 schools in the district and so forth. I think we really need to take and trust our teachers to look at the data within our students in our school and make decisions what's best for them. Obviously, personalized learning is going to be, and competency-based, number one to me, because no two children learn alike. So it's very important, and I'm really grateful that the positive through COVID right now has helped us all realize that quality over quantity also. It's not about did I get through all the standards. Did they actually understand? So I think the biggest thing I want to help people understand is we want students to understand the standard and know it and be able to apply and teach it, not just go through the motions for the points. So if we can get away from looking at points and look at skills, if we can trust our students and let them make choice in their educational process, but before we can do that, obviously, is empower our teachers and trust our teachers and provide them with all of the resources they need in the professional development so that they can be a facilitator and a mentor and set everything up for them. And technology also, remember, one-to-one is important, and having a consistent platform for your teachers to where everybody uses it, whether it's Canvas or Blackboard, or we chose Google. So it's a one-stop shop for your kids. Just having consistency and providing empowerment and training and trust.
And Chelsea?
I would say we started this panel really talking about there are some schools that seem to have managed to kind of pull through this better than others. And I think I would end by saying, I also think there are opportunities in this kind of ground shifting moment, both from the effects of COVID-19 and sort of rising recognition of the role of education in perpetuating racism in our country. There are opportunities for all schools now to make different choices about how they do what they do and why they do what they do. And so to the extent that our policies can seek to kind of reduce the competing demands on schools so that they can really focus in on building their culture and their kind of DNA to do something really targeted and specific for the communities that they're in, that will bring us out the other end of this, I think, in a better place.
We are at the end of our time. I want to wrap up again, really thanking the three of you, Chelsea, Allie, and Nicki. I think you have been fantastic and given us a lot to think about. I know that I'm about halfway through the many, many questions I have here and the ideas that you've generated for me, and I'm greatly appreciative of that. So thank you all, and thank you all who joined us today.